So anyway, I'm going to, as I say, give two talks in one, and this is why. I am going to talk about the work that I've been doing over a very long period of time and what that work consists of at the moment, namely the implementation of what I call the SENS paradigm, the damage repair paradigm for bringing aging under medical control and keeping people healthy and youthful as they get chronologically older. And some of you are familiar with my work in this area, and some of you are not. But it's also the case that some of you are, and some of you are not, familiar with a topic that is very dear to the heart of the Hexagon community, namely the things that have happened to a very large amount of money that hexagons, among others, but mostly hexagons, donated to my work more than 2.5 years ago in July of 2021. And I'm going to be talking about where that stands right now as well. So I'm going to start by pointing out that because this is being live streamed and it will be on YouTube in perpetuity, I have been fairly liberal with regard to density of these slides. Especially in the second half of the talk, you'll see that I'm using a lot of text. And so I want to emphasize that what I'd like you to do today while I'm speaking is to listen to what I say rather than to try to read what I have written, because you can always go back and read what I've written later on. Essentially, there's an awful lot to say. All right, so for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk science. I'm going to talk about what I do, why it makes sense, and where it's going right now. And it all starts out from an idea that I had 23.5 years ago, excuse me, which was a new way of going about keeping people healthy as they get older. So it all is summed up by this very simple slide that I'm showing you here. And I'm going to talk you through this slide for a couple of minutes. At the end of the day, what we want to do, if we're talking about keeping people fully functioning like young adults, however long ago they were actually born, what we mean there is that we want to prevent the thing that currently happens, which is that the longer your body functions, the more it becomes unable to function. And that is summed up by the three words that you see at the bottom of this slide: metabolism, damage, and pathology. Metabolism is the word that biologists use to denote the entire network of processes that the body performs day in, day out, just to keep us alive. And the reason we get sick when we get old is very simple. It's because metabolism has side effects. Those side effects, which I'm using the word damage to denote, those side effects consist of changes to the molecular and cellular structure of the body, of our various organs and tissues. Now, those changes are initially harmless because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of those changes. But the key thing is they happen throughout life because metabolism has to happen throughout life. Even before we're born, we have to, we have to perform these processes. So for our entire life, damage is being laid down. And the reason why it's appropriate to use the word damage to denote those changes is because the body is only set up to tolerate a certain amount of them. Eventually, there's more than that of those changes, and we start to go downhill. In other words, that's the process on the right-hand side where damage creates pathology. That is what happens late in life. It doesn't happen early in life because the body can handle the small amount of damage that the body has early in life, but late in life, that's what happens. So our goal, if we think about aging, if we define aging in this way, as this process of metabolism creating damage and then that damage eventually creating pathology, our goal is to separate metabolism from pathology. And there are various ways we might do that. A couple of hundred years ago, when people started to get quite good at preventing the health problems of early life, the infections like tuberculosis and diphtheria and so on that used to kill at least 1/3 of babies before the age of 1, even in the wealthiest countries in the world, people said, well, okay, let's try and tackle the health problems of late life in the same way. And essentially what that amounts to, if we couch that in terms of the definition of aging that I've just given you, is it's an attempt to separate metabolism from pathology by separating damage from pathology, by directly attacking the health problems of late life and trying to eliminate them from the body in the same kind of way that one would eliminate an infection. And sure enough, it doesn't work, because this thing called damage is continuing to accumulate, and as a result, anything that tries to attack the consequences of damage inherently becomes progressively less effective as the person gets older. All right, now, about 100 years ago, in the early part of the 20th century, a few people started to realize what I've just told you. They said, geriatrics is not going to work. We're not going to be able to cure the health problems of late life. Instead, another way to separate metabolism from pathology would be to separate metabolism from damage. In other words, to try and effectively make the body run more cleanly, to get it to create damage more slowly than it naturally does. And that's a really neat idea. It would obviously postpone the age at which the damage gets to the point that kicks off the right-hand process, the point that becomes pathogenic. But that doesn't work either, it turns out, essentially because metabolism is just too complicated, and more precisely because the creation of damage is just too inextricably intertwined with the things that we need metabolism to do to keep us alive. So we end up, basically, it's also a non-starter. The gerontology approach, as I'm calling it here, also has completely failed to deliver any postponement of the health problems of late life. All right, so where I came in 23 and a half years ago, is I came up with this idea of the maintenance approach. Call it the damage repair approach, call it the rejuvenation approach. And this says, well, okay, we want to separate metabolism from pathology. We can actually do it without separating metabolism from damage or separating damage from pathology. Instead, what we can do is address the damage itself. We can go in, we can develop medicines, maybe, that can remove some of the damage every so often, so that even though metabolism is generating damage at the normal rate, we haven't done anything about that, nevertheless, the damage never reaches the point, the level of abundance that causes the pathologies to start happening. And this approach was quite a hard sell, to be honest, in the academic community. It took maybe best part of 10 years for me to persuade my colleagues that this made sense. But the fact is, it is a common sense approach, because we already do it successfully with simple machines like cars. This is a car that's, of course, more than 100 years old, and it's working every bit as well as it did when it was built, the day it was built. Why? Not because it was designed or built to last 100 years, not at all. It was built to last maybe 10 years. But its owners fell in love with it and have done such thorough preventative maintenance on it over all those years that here it is working just fine. This car has completely transcended its warranty period. And if we get into the specifics of the biology, we can actually describe this in very concrete terms. On the left-hand side of this table, we have a bunch of categories of damage. And this list of categories of damage seems to be exhaustive. It's the list that I came up with more than 20 years ago, and I'm still getting away with it. There is really nothing to add to this list. And the reason this list is important, this list of categories on the left, is because of the right-hand side of the table. It's because each category lines up with a particular approach to actually doing the repair of that damage. So to just give an illustration in the interest of time, let me talk about the first category, cell loss. What's happening there is simply cells are dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells, right? So the number of cells goes down. And the obvious way to fix that is to put those cells back. And that's what stem cell therapy is all about. You put cells back into the body that can replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own by cell division. So, fine. And in fact, that was already established as a concept 20 odd years ago when I started talking this way. So the organizations that I have led have never actually worked on stem cell therapy to speak of. But the other 6 categories were much less far advanced. And so in some of these cases, I actually had to come up with the approach to deal with them. Certainly the one talking about foreign enzymes to remove waste products inside cells, that was my idea. But mostly I was just casting around looking for things that had been developed in other parts of biology, in other parts of medical research, that were not necessarily looking at aging at all. And so this was the first time that anybody had come up with a comprehensive plan to actually keep people healthy as they get older. And as I say, it took a while to convince people that this was a sensible concept, but I got there in the end. And perhaps the best demonstration of that is this paper that came out just over 10 years ago. It's, when I say too many citations to count, I'm not kidding. This is by far the most highly cited paper in the biology of aging this century, and it's very probably going to stay that way. And it's just a restatement of what I had said a decade earlier. So that really shows you that this is an idea whose time has come, that has actually now been recognized as the way to go. Furthermore, things are getting better all the time. So back in 2000, 2001, I had one plan for each of the categories that I listed. Here are those same categories on the left here. And for every single one of them, there's now an additional approach, at least one, for doing the same thing. Now, that's important because this is pioneering technology, right? So we don't know how long it's going to take to get a particular thing going. Therefore, if we're trying multiple approaches simultaneously, then we're improving our chances of getting everything working reasonably soon. So that's very heartening. And another thing that's very heartening is that the private sector is involved now. I mentioned this actually on the previous slide here at the bottom. This is not just being done in academia or in non-profit organizations like mine. This is being pursued by startup companies that are getting the kind of money that you get when your investor is hoping to get money back. So that's great news. So now let me talk about what I'm doing at the moment. I have this new organization, LEV Foundation, Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, and our main work consists of unprecedentedly ambitious and audacious experiments on mice, trying to get them to live longer. Mice are, of course, the organism of choice in medical research. Everything gets tested on mice. And longevity research is no different. But what we're doing is we are trying to improve the quality of information that we get from mice by doing experiments that nobody else is doing. Specifically, number one, we are working with mice that are already in middle age before we even do anything to them. That's really important. It's much more relevant to humans than things that are done by congenital mutations, for example. So the mice that we work with normally live about 2.5 years, and the experiment that we're doing started when the mice were 1.5 years old already, with only 1 year left to live on average in the absence of any treatment. The second thing that we are doing, which is not being done by hardly anybody else, is we're not just testing individual interventions, we're testing a combination of interventions. And of course, the goal is to try to get a lot more benefit than you could get with only one. We have actually chosen our interventions for this experiment on the basis that individually they already have some effect when you give them to mice late in life. But we are hoping that that magnitude of that effect will be much greater with a combination. And the third thing that makes our experiment very unusual is that we are looking at damage repair interventions. We're not trying to just slow aging down and mimic other things that might do that. We're actually trying to take mice that are already in middle age or older and fix them up, genuinely rejuvenate them. So I have here the list of the 4 interventions that we're doing at the moment. These are all things that are already established to have benefits in mice. And the experiment started nearly a year ago. And we're very happy with how it's going. I haven't got any data to show you today, and that's kind of on purpose, because I want you to go to Twitter or indeed to our website, levf.org, and look at the updates that I'm putting out. One of the advantages of leading a non-profit organization that's funded essentially entirely by philanthropy is that I'm able to tell the world interim results. I don't have to worry about protecting my intellectual property or getting priority of publication like academics need to. So there's plenty of interim data online right now, and I'm delighted to say that the experiment does seem to be going awfully well. The mice have got to the point of their average lifespan, and sure enough, about half of the control mice that are not getting any of these interventions have now died, but only a rather small proportion of those mice, of the mice that are getting the interventions, have died. So we're pretty happy about that. Now, as you can see here, we're also measuring health, not just lifespan. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I'll skip this slide because it's just talking about the details of the of how we're structuring the experiment with the treatment groups, and that's something again that you can read up in a lot of detail on our website. And this is about where we measure things. But the key thing I want to talk about right now is what we're measuring, which is here. We're measuring a lot of aspects of health. And luckily, here is something where we did not need to invent all of this, because the measurements that we're doing are things that have been established and refined by other researchers working on mouse longevity over many, many years. So everything we're doing here is very established. Some of the things that are biomarkers of mouse health are just visual. You can look and see, are they losing hair? It turns out that alopecia is something that, excuse me, that progresses quite clearly in mice. So you can just look for it. You can just say, okay, how much hair have they lost? And is that being postponed by the treatments? Another thing you can do is look for curvature of the spine, because it turns out that mice get hunchback. That's what's called kyphosis. That's the technical term. We can also measure functional things, such as memory, cognitive things. There are established tests for that. We can measure muscle function and agility. So a rotor rod is basically what it says on the tin. You put your mouse on a horizontal rod, and then you have a system that rotates the rod. And it rotates it progressively faster and faster until the mouse falls off. And you ask, how soon does the mouse fall off? It turns out that as mice get older, they get less good at that. So you can get a measure of biological age that way, and so on. And the key thing that I want to close with in this part of the talk is the analysis of organs and tissues after mice have died, because that is something that we are looking for collaborators on. If there's anyone here listening to this talk who works with mice or who knows someone who does, we are eagerly seeking collaborations with researchers who have the relevant expertise to look at these various tissues and ask questions about how old they are biologically, questions that can't be asked non-invasively by mice that are still alive. So the question you may have is, okay, well, what's next? This experiment is happening. That's great. It's not going to be over for at least another year and a half. And we hope it will be a little longer than that, of course, because we hope that the experiment will really allow mice to live a lot longer. But it's happening. So you may ask, what's going to happen next? And the answer certainly is we want to do another experiment of the same type, which we're calling RMR2. Let me explain what RMR stands for. It simply stands for robust mouse rejuvenation. So we could just do the same experiment with different doses of the various treatments. And that would give some information, but it would not give as much information as we can get from other things. Furthermore, we could also just wait and not do anything until we get results from the current experiment. But that doesn't make sense either, because there's a lot of literature out there that is showing the promise of a lot of different ways to keep mice alive for longer and healthy for longer. So we want to start the second experiment at once. And for that reason, we have already very much designed it. Here it is. As you can see, again, we have 4 different interventions. So the overall design of the experiment will be the same as it was in the current one. We're also going to do a few other different things. We're going to give mice a couple of things that are pretty much proven to be really good for mice, so as to have a better baseline, essentially to make it more difficult to improve things with the therapies. The idea here is we want to get as good a signal to noise ratio as we can, so as to maximize the likelihood that this therapy can be translated to humans. I'm going to close this part of the talk talking about what LEV Foundation is doing at the moment with one thing that is not a research thing, but is very much an advocacy thing and a very important one. We believe that the world needs to wake up to the critical need to work more on bringing aging under medical control. And we believe that a fundamental reason why it's been so difficult to wake the world up to that is that most people simply don't want to get their hopes up. They believe that, yes, maybe we might be able to do this in the future, but they don't know how soon. And they know that we don't know how soon because this is pioneering technology. So they say to themselves, well, we'll believe it when we see it. But that means that there is no incentive for elected representatives, for example, to spend taxpayers' money on this. And that's appalling because it slows the research down a lot. So this year, one thing we did was we got together with a bunch of really high-powered luminaries in the field, completely, unassailably credentialed mainstream researchers in the biology of aging, especially Brian Kennedy, who runs the Center for Healthy Aging in Singapore, worked closely with us on this. And we came up with some extremely aggressive text saying that, look, it is simply no longer scientific to claim that aging is just off limits to medicine and we're never going to get anywhere with it. We are making headway, rapid headway, and the more we try, the faster we're going to bring aging under truly comprehensive medical control and thereby save an enormous number of lives and alleviate an astronomical amount of suffering. So we believe that this is a really important thing to do. And the thing I really want to emphasize here is that we are not only collecting the names of top luminaries in the field, we've got more than 100 of them, and that's most of the field, but we're also collecting names from the general public. And we've already got more than 2,000 of them, but we want 200,000. We really do. We want this to be a truly mainstream grassroots movement. And so that will be a huge goal for us over the coming year, will be to broaden this, to get it much more exposure, especially in the most high-profile mainstream media, and to get hundreds of thousands of signatures. Okay, so that is talk number one. So now for talk number two. Most of you will know that in May or so of 2021, Richard Hart decided to help out the longevity research that I was doing by making it possible for people who wanted to get in on Pulse to donate to Sense Research Foundation, the organization that I was leading at that time, and thereby to get Pulse for cheap, but also to help longevity research. And that all came together in the middle of July of 2021 in the form of a 2-week sacrifice phase, during which hexagons, among others, but mostly hexagons, donated an enormous amount of money, $27.5 million, which was completely transformative. Sense Research Foundation's research budget was maybe $3 or $4 million per year at that point. So this was enormous. But somehow or other, the board of directors at Sense Research Foundation, which consisted of people that I did not appoint, because they were appointed way back when I didn't know anything about how to run an organization in like 2009, they decided to get rid of me and to turn the organization into something different. They did this just 1 month after the airdrop, after the sacrifice phase. This caused a bit of consternation. My staff didn't think much of it and were able to force the board to bring me back in a kind of partial way, but not for long, because in March of 2022, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I gave a talk to the hexing community in Las Vegas and highlighted what was going on. And lo and behold, the board didn't like that. And they especially didn't like the consequence of that talk, which was a lawsuit. The 3 of the 4 largest donors to the airdrop sued Sense Research Foundation, and they didn't like that very much. The suit, of course, was for fraud, that Sense Research Foundation's board had already been plotting to oust me at the time that they were representing to the wider world that I would substantially control how donated money was spent. And then they made that not possible. Now, a remarkable thing happened in 2022, which was that the lawsuit only lasted about 3.5 months. Towards the end of July of 2022, the foundation settled the lawsuit, perhaps not so coincidentally avoiding the discovery phase that would have ensued thereafter. So some of you may be very interested to know what the settlement was. And unfortunately, I can't tell you. And the reason I can't tell you is because Sense Research Foundation insisted that the specific terms of the settlement should not be made public and should only be known to the parties to the settlement. And of course, I myself was not a plaintiff. However, a certain amount of information is at this point public, and I'm listing some of it here. Very shortly after the settlement, Sense Research Foundation paid $2 million to another foundation, the Methuselah Foundation, which actually was the first organization that I co-founded. And a year later, they paid another $1 million. Now, I can only tell you that it's coincidence, but the fact is that the Methuselah Foundation donated the very similar amounts to LEV Foundation shortly afterwards on both occasions. So you can draw your own conclusions as to what the settlement may have said. But the fact is, $3 million is a small proportion of $27 million. And sure enough, if you look at the IRS form that any nonprofit has to submit for 2022, you will find that indeed the Sense Research Foundation has about $20 million in the bank. And this is indeed also recorded in the annual report that the foundation put out in 2023. Another thing that is noted in that annual report is that the research budget has not increased. In fact, it's gone down relative to what it was in the days when I was in charge. That, I would suggest, is probably not what the airdrop donors were expecting when they donated to the foundation. And it is certainly not what would have happened had I had a say in what happened. Another thing that was revealed in the most recent annual report from Sense Research Foundation is that they're hardly getting any money in, any income. The numbers that are shown in the annual report are somewhat distorted, but I can tell you that $500,000 of the 1.4 million that is reported there was actually airdrop money. The reason it's reported as 2022 income is because it came via our UK affiliate, SRF EU, which was the place for donors from the UK and Europe to donate to if they wanted a tax break. That money sat in England for a year, and that's why it was reported as 2022 income by SRF. There were various other, let me call it distortions of income. So the number I'm giving you there of less than $500,000 is generous, to be honest, in terms of what actually came in from donors. And I have it on very good authority that 2023 has been no different. And that's no surprise, of course, because the fact is Sense Research Foundation no longer has a value proposition. It no longer has proper scientific leadership. You know, who would bother donating to Sense Research Foundation now? So you may ask, you know, what's going on? What is Sense Research Foundation about? And it's pretty obvious. The board of directors, as of now, consists of 4 people, all of whom were directors at the time that I was ousted. And they know that they broke the law. After all, that's why they capitulated in 2022 in order to hide the fact that they broke the law. They also know that Sense Research Foundation is a dead man walking. It is a completely moribund organization. Therefore, in the interest of their own, not just ego, but also professional reputation, they only have one thing on their mind, which is to stretch out the capital, in other words, your money, until everyone forgets what they did. Problem is that that's actually slowing research down a lot. And I don't have to tell you guys that every day that we delay the defeat of aging means 110,000 people dying, 30 World Trade Centers. That's a lot of people. And of course, it's not just the death, it's also the astronomical amount of suffering that precedes those deaths. And the vermin who populate the board of directors of Sense Research Foundation are just not thinking about that. They just don't care about that. they are willing to prevent research from happening and cost innumerable lives in order just to hide from the things that they did a few years ago. And it's having practical consequences right now. I mentioned to you 10 or 15 minutes ago that we already know what we want to do with our next tranche of money. We need to fund another of these experiments. These big experiments that look at combinations of late onset interventions, they are not cheap. They cost $3.5–4 million each because it's 1,000 mice that we're treating. And the current experiment that's happening is already paid for by and large, so that's fine. But we want to kick off the next one. We need to kick off the next one. And the longer we don't, the more lives will be lost through delay in the defeat of aging. So the fact is, I'm not just grandstanding here. This is not just rhetoric. This is not me, being hurt, taking personally the fact that people turned on me. This is truly a crime against humanity that is being committed today by the people who are controlling your money at Sense Research Foundation. So we have to ask, what can be done and who can do it? Before I get onto that, let me point out this. I have brought this up, you will not be surprised to learn, with Sense Research Foundation. I've done so publicly. And I embarrassed them into having to say why they are not increasing research budget in consequence of having so much money in the bank. They say, well, that's the responsible thing to do because a responsible organization has a nice long runway, a nice long amount of time that it can stay in business, even in the worst case scenario in terms of income. And currently, sure enough, their runway is 4 years, maybe 5 years, even with no income, which is basically what they have. But the thing is, that's not how Sense Research Foundation was ever run. We always had a runway around 1 year, never more than 2 years. And they're trying to say that that was fiscally imprudent. Now, you could say that if you were running a different nonprofit. But they're not running a different nonprofit. They're running Sense Research Foundation. They're running an organization that had a deliberate policy of living hand to mouth, spending money pretty much as soon as we got it, having a short runway. And what do you know? Donors liked that because they wanted to save lives. They wanted us to save lives. You did not donate to an organization that tried to have a runway of 4 or 5 years. You donated to Sense Research Foundation with its commitment to spending money and saving lives as quickly as possible. So what does this mean in practice? Well, fact is, there was this lawsuit. It was rather successful in 2022, and it was settled, which means that there is nothing to stop other people who gave money in the airdrop in July of 2021 from doing the same thing, from suing Sense Research Foundation. The chance of success of such a lawsuit is obviously extremely high, since it will basically be a copycat of what happened before. Furthermore, the evidence that donor intent is being flouted, in other words, that there is fraud going on, there was fraud going on at the time the donation occurred, that evidence is even stronger than it was in 2022, because we have now 2 years of hoarding of money that was supposed to be spent. This time, the chances are that such an action will be a class action. In other words, it would include all the airdrop donors, all 2,000 of you, And of course, what we'd like is for the lawsuit not to happen, but rather for the directors to cave in and recognize the error of their ways. We have to give them some kind of carrot for that. And of course, the carrot will be non-disparagement. I've been fairly disparaging of the directors today, and I've been so quite a lot, but I can be a great deal more disparaging if I want to. However, I'd be happy not to if and once I get all your money back and am able to direct it to the place that you wanted it directed to place. Now, key thing here is that this is already underway. People who are up for being the named plaintiffs on such an action are in place. We have the retainer in place to get top lawyers to get this going. When I say we here, of course, I do not actually mean we, because I would not be a plaintiff. This is something where the people who have been defrauded are the donors, and I did not donate in the airdrop. So I mean you. The fact is, though, if you want to know more about this, if you're interested in getting involved, then you know how to find me. So I'll stop there. I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any. This, of course, is our website and my email address. And I am happy to have been here, and I thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and how you're trying to make this right when it comes to the intentions of the airdrop donors. It really impresses me, your character and how you're, trying to make this right. I think that it's just such an obvious win for the longevity space to have you in charge of the funds that you're supposed to be in charge of. And, to have the courts settle that is going to be great.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? I don't know how that works.
Go ahead and put your questions here in the chat. Lots of just support going on in the chat right now. We have 340 people watching live. Typically, we're getting about 10 to 20,000 views on the rewind version of this. And so go ahead, and it'll take a couple of minutes for people to get their questions in. Now, one of the things I know that you're interested in doing is another mice study, to have another 1,000 mice. Even though the current one is still going super well, there's more treatments that can be tested. Can you tell us what are the other treatments that are wanting to be tested if
Certainly.
you're able to get the amount of money that's needed?
Certainly. Let me see if I can go back to my slides. Is that possible? I don't know whether I can. Okay, so I had a slide on that. Here it is. So let me go through these 4 things at the top here. So deuterium, as most of you will probably know, is heavy hydrogen with an extra neutron. And it turns out that you can replace the hydrogens in any molecule you like with deuterium. There are various ways to do it. There's a particularly efficient catalytic process for doing it with fatty acids. And 20 odd years ago, someone named Mikhail Shapinov decided this might actually have therapeutic benefit, because you might be able to do it in a way that would slow down unwanted reactions, in particular the oxidation of fatty acids. And sure enough, it works. So this is something that's now been used not only in the lab, but even in the clinic for various congenital diseases that are characterized by high oxidative stress. And there's good reason to believe that this will have a significant impact on lifespan. So, and you don't even need to give very much of the stuff, because even if a small proportion of your fatty acids are deuterated in this way and thus essentially prevented from being oxidized, then that's works like cobalt rods in a nuclear reactor. It kind of prevents a chain reaction. Then the second one is something called partial reprogramming. This is something that's very popular right now. It has led to the creation of very large companies like Altos and New Limit. New Limit, of course, is well known to the crypto community because it was created by Brian Armstrong from Coinbase. So the idea here is that you do in the body of a living organism the same thing that a guy named Shinya Yamanaka discovered you could do in cell culture about 15 years ago, or more like 18 years ago now. Namely, you overexpress a bunch of proteins that essentially turn the developmental clock of the cell backwards. It was shown by a guy named Belmonte in several years ago now that you could do this in vivo, in the body of mice. And this has become quite a big deal. So we want to try this. But we want to try it in a manner that is delivered as gene therapy, which is not something that's been done before. The next thing we want to do is look at exosomes. So it's been established that that there are these little vesicles, little bags of stuff that cells secrete and that other cells take up. And they're very important in cellular communication. And a particular type of cell that releases these things quite heavily is what are called mesenchymal stem cells. So we want to inject these cells so that they can secrete exosomes and rejuvenate the body. We get these cells from either young mice or else we make them in a manner that makes them biologically young. And then finally, albumin. Albumin is by far the most abundant protein in the bloodstream, in the plasma. And it plays an enormously large number of roles in essentially keeping the blood uncontaminated. But the albumin itself becomes contaminated with age. So we want to put in pristine albumin that is like younger than young almost. So those are the four things that are currently what we're wanting to combine.
Awesome. Now, when it comes to, I guess, like how big of a deal you are in the longevity space, let's just review like all the name dropping you can do of people, other people that our audience would have heard of. What are some of the big names in longevity tech that you go a long ways back with? And how is what you're doing different than what they're doing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I go back with everybody. You know, I've been around a rather long time, but yeah, the main difference between what we're doing and what other people are doing is that because we are funded by philanthropy, we are able to do things that are outside of the, if you like, the incentive structure of other people. So let me group other people a little bit, you know, oversimplistically, but nevertheless into two parts. There are people who work in the private sector, and there are people who work in academia. In the private sector, clearly, you know, people have to prioritize things that are going to make their investors get rich later on, which means they've got to worry about things like intellectual property. They've got to invent new drugs. You know, the things that we do tend either they're off patent or they're never patentable in the first place. And, you know, no one in the private sector is going to work on those things. Then in academia, there's a different problem, which is the peer review system. The fact that essentially you can only work on things that are fashionable because the money that comes from the government is allocated on the basis of essentially whether your colleagues think that the experiment you want to do is a good idea. And deciding that in advance, you know, it's almost the antithesis of how science is. You know, science is supposed to be a process of being wrong, being in the minority of one, you know, as often as possible by thinking of things that other people haven't thought of. And, you know, so basically, yeah, I mean, public funding for science in general, and certainly for longevity science, is an absolute catastrophe right now, and has always been, really. So again, this is something that nobody else is doing this work because they can't get the money to do it.
However, all the millionaires and billionaires out there in cryptocurrency, they can donate directly to what you're doing at levf.org. Is that correct?
That is exactly right. So I'm going to just work through the various questions I'm seeing on the public chat, because that's going to be the simplest way for me to do this. I think
I've started. Yeah, I've started a couple of them. Here's one that I think represents a lot of what people are thinking.
Okay,
what supplement should we be taking right now? You might not be able to speak to it, but it's a question.
Well, that's right. This is one of the questions I get all the time, but I cannot speak to because that's not what I work on. You know, I work on things that don't yet exist. I work on things that you know, will do much better than anything that you know, we have today. And there are plenty of other people who are expert on this, on recommending which supplements to take. And of course, different people recommend different things. So I don't really have something to say there. I do want to focus on the next one, which is, would I be happy with 10 million settlement and they can keep the rest? Honestly, no, to be honest, you know, because, you know, it's all your money. All 20 million, not just 10 million, is yours. Now, arguably, one could say, well, okay, we leave them the 10 million, they'll just carry on doing the stuff they're already doing, which is, after all, broadly speaking, the projects that I had already put in place before I was kicked out. So it wouldn't be the end of the world if we had that kind of settlement. But honestly, the projects that are still going on at Sense Research Foundation are definitely drifting. They are not being pursued nearly as efficiently and effectively as they would be if I were there actually providing scientific leadership. So honestly, no, I wouldn't. Then somebody says, go on Rogan. I'd love to go on Rogan again. I've been on Joe Rogan twice before. He's a great guy. He seems to like me. So yeah, Joe, you can have me back whenever you want. Then you know, people saying things like, how do I regrow my hair? That's again something I don't work on. You know, loss of hair is not life-threatening. Someone says, is LEV still on course for 2032? Well, actually, 2032 is not quite what I said. It's more like 2036. But I believe, yes, it's just as on course as it was. It has my time frames have not slipped in the past decade, really. I've been saying, you know, mid to late 2030s since about 2014, 2015. So yeah, I'm pretty happy about that. Yes. No, the whole point is, you know, someone said, I only have access to undeuteurated arachidonic acid. Yeah, no, the deuteration is the point. Yeah, someone's making some snarky comment about my beard. Yeah, right. That happens. I'm just looking down the list for anything that is a meaningful question. Yeah, someone says, is there a way to lengthen my telomeres? So first thing I want to say is it's not by any means clear that lengthening of telomeres is a good thing. There are reasons why we might not want to do so, because lengthening of telomeres would be helpful for cancers. However, there are arguments that says that on balance, lengthening telomeres may be a good thing. And sure enough, it turns out to be a good thing in mice. This was shown by a couple of groups over the years. And it's for that reason that we are actually doing exactly that. We are expressing, we're doing telomerase gene therapy in mice in our current experiment, RMR1, the one that's going on right now. So yeah, that's definitely there. Then let me see what else we have. Peer-reviewed science is losing its significance because the peers are all biased. Well, not exactly biased. They're covering their asses, I think is probably the answer to that. Will I wear a HEX t-shirt on Rogan? Absolutely, I will. No question. I'd be delighted to do that.
Wow.
Do I do any research on the inhabitants of Okinawa? No, but I know people who do. However, one thing I want to emphasize about Okinawa and other blue zones, as they're often called, is that people there do not live all that much longer than people in surrounding areas, maybe a couple of years. And furthermore, they die of the same kinds of things. So I'm aiming a lot higher than blue zones. That's the important thing. Someone says they'd love to hear my thoughts on spirituality and longevity. So let me briefly say something about that. I think that spirituality is perhaps too narrow a word here. What I think is very important to appreciate is that there is a meaningful thing called the mind-body connection. In other words, if you're less stressed, you're probably going to be less stressed physically as well. We've certainly found over the years, when I say we here, I mean the longevity community in general, the research community, that people who live exceptionally long, such as centenarians, are particularly good at handling stress. Nothing bothers them. And that's more or less the only thing that centenarians have in common. So definitely, whatever works for you, whether it's spirituality or meditation or yoga or, for me, I stare at the sky from my hot tub, right? Whatever works to minimize stress is definitely good for you. Someone says, how can we regrow a limb? So this is actually a really interesting area of research, which people are very much looking at. Of course, certain amphibians can regrow limbs multiple times, no less. And we're getting closer to being able to understand how and what we might want to do to get a mammal to do that, and of course, eventually a human. We can't do it yet, but it's a very vibrant and promising research area. Someone says, who's taking care of all the mice? We got so lucky there. This experiment is being performed by a company named Icor Life Sciences, which was actually one of our first spin-outs from Sense Research Foundation. We spun it out to pursue one of our projects, a project that's focused on macular degeneration. And that work has gone really well. And it was already going well when we spun it out, of course, but it's gone next few steps, and it's now being sold to big pharma. So that's a really big breakthrough. But in parallel with that, Icor decided several years ago that they would start a CRO division, a contract research organization division. So they do a lot of work, including mouse lifespan experiments for longevity companies around the world. And so we thought we'll use them for our work. And this is the biggest experiment they've ever done by a long way, but that's the only real difference. They've got the skills to do all this. So we're really delighted, and they've done a massively wonderful job. I'm really, really happy about it. I'm just going down. Yeah, someone says, HEX t-shirt on Rogan, you heard it here. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that. I'm just going down. Are aspiring medical students being taught this curriculum? I wish. But of course, the thing about being a medical student is you've got so much to learn about what's already prescribable, right? What's already got through the whole process of research and regulation. And what I'm doing hasn't happened yet. Somebody says, who will be my successor? How dare you say anything like that? I'm not planning on dying. I mean, honestly. Would longevity enhance wisdom? We shall see. We shall certainly see. My grandmother is 100 and she hates everything. Yeah, I understand that. Is it true that Amish people are less prone to diseases? I don't think so. I think the Amish have good dietary habits. Not the Amish, but one blue zone is Loma Linda in Southern California, which is the epicenter of Seventh-day Adventism. And, they don't smoke at all. They don't drink at all. The joke is that they die of boredom. Possible. I'm still going down the list. I'm nearly there. Do we share research or collaborate with others in the field? Absolutely. We do not really generate IP. We are all over collaboration. We do stuff that other people can't do precisely because they have to care about the IP. And so we are in a position to be a resource for the community, to provide information and reagents, actually, like, for example, the tissues from our mice that we're freezing and fixing. So we are all over collaboration. The mice are indeed from Jackson Labs, as somebody asks. Yeah, Brett Weinstein is kind of right in saying that. The mice are healthy. And actually they have another strain of mice called HEX3, which is even healthier than the ones that we're using, which is C57 Black 6. And in the second study that we want to do soon, we may switch to this other strain, HEX3. But this is important. We want to use mice that start out already being very healthy. We don't want to start with mice that are sick normally, because then extending their lifespan might be just fixing the thing that those particular mice are sick of, which is definitely not something that we want to be doing.
Well, Aubrey, I've got my next panel of 7 people here, but I wanted to take a couple minutes to brag about 4 things in the HEX community, since this is the 4th annual HEX conference. There are some things I'm really proud of this year. One, HEX is up 33% today. That hasn't happened every day, but today it seems like people are really taking advantage of the opportunity. So that's notable. This year at the 4th annual HEX conference, we have 102 speakers over 4 days. That's incredible. That's a new all-time high in the number of people participating in the conference. We also, there's no other cryptocurrency who has people who have time locked and sent money to their future self as much as in HEX. And I think that's where the real synergy is between what you're doing with longevity and between HEX. And so with Richard Hart kind of, pointing to the opportunity for people to support you, I think that's only going to continue. And because crypto goes in these 4-year cycles, I anticipate more good times again in the future where people will be able to donate more than maybe they can now. Although nobody should be stopped from donating to you now. The 4th thing that I want to show off is the HEX conference is the first crypto conference to use artificial intelligence to do lip syncing translations into other languages. And I have like a 20-second clip here of you speaking Mandarin. Now, is that a language that you're fluent in?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay. All right. Well, here we go.
关于面对面会议，当然，你知道，我理解这需要更多的努力和更多的金钱等等才能完成其中之一。由于 COVID， 很多人停止了这些活动，很多组织，但是现在我又开始组织自己的会议了。从去年9月在都柏林举办的那个开始，这真是太解放了，因为我
It's absolutely extraordinary.
I've run that by people who speak Mandarin, and we have lots of examples that we've been showing off, like Richard Hart speaking Portuguese and Fashion Coder speaking. I'm not sure. Well, she was speaking Mandarin and another language as well, Japanese. I mean, this is a huge breakthrough, and the better somebody's lighting, the better it allows the voice. Well, the voice cloning is a feature on its own, and then the lighting helps with the lip morphing and that sort of thing. But anyway, yeah, really excited about the future of technology and longevity. And so I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for you coming on again the conference this year.
Well, thank you again, Matty. It's always a pleasure to be here. So that's and congratulations on another really successful event.